The night Maren Caldwell signed the $26 million deal, she came home with champagne and a decision already made. Elias Reed, the quiet man she had spent years calling a failure, sat alone at the dining table, and she handed him a suitcase she had already packed. He said nothing, set his key on the table, and walked out into the rain carrying only a worn leather briefcase. 3 days later, Maren sat before the board of directors, ready to receive her future. When the closing documents were opened, his name appeared on every single page, and the truth silenced the entire room. Stay until the end to find out whether Elias would save the wife who betrayed him, or take back everything that was rightfully his. The evening had begun at the top floor of the Blackwood Grand, a hotel that had been built for the kind of celebration money makes possible when ambition finally catches what it has been chasing. Where the furniture cost more than most starting salaries, and the view of the city below existed to remind whoever stood at the window that they were not among the people looking up. Victor Ashbourne stood at the head of the long glass table with the practiced ease of a man who had signed documents worth more than most people would earn in a lifetime. And when he raised his crystal glass toward Maren, the gesture carried the weight of an official coronation. He told her that Caldwell Vector was about to enter an era where there was no longer room for ordinary people, and Maren understood the remark perfectly. It was not a toast to the future, but a quiet dismissal of her past. A past that included a husband who attended none of these dinners, whose name never appeared in a press release, whose contributions she had long since stopped counting as contributions at all. Victor was 58 years old and had the kind of silver authority that made younger entrepreneurs believe he was offering them a gift when he was really measuring the distance between their need and his leverage. Maren felt none of that danger in the moment, only the warmth of the champagne, the congratulations of the room, and the clean certainty that she had finally arrived somewhere worth being. The preliminary agreement was signed before 10 o'clock, the ink still wet on the page that would change everything, and she ordered a car back to the apartment, already rehearsing how the news would feel out loud. Elias was sitting at the kitchen table when she walked in, and the stillness of him struck her as it always did. The kind of stillness that had once felt like steadiness, and had somewhere along the years come to feel like stagnation. He did not congratulate her immediately but asked, in that measured way of his, whether she had read through Appendix 7.4, the Intellectual Property Ownership Clause. The question landed between them, like a stone dropped into still water, small but impossible to ignore, and Maren felt something sharp move through her chest that she chose to interpret as irritation rather than the thing it actually was, which was fear. She told him that she did not need him to audit her agreements, that she had built this company without his help, that his name appeared nowhere in the press releases because he had never earned the right to be there. 8 years, she told him. 8 years of standing in the background without a title, without a company, without a contribution she could point to at a dinner table and make people admire. She had been defending his silence for 8 years, and she was finished defending it. The suitcase was already packed in the closet, which meant the decision was not impulsive but deliberate, not made in the heat of the evening, but carried into the evening like a weapon prepared in advance, and she placed it at his feet with the calm of a woman who believed she was finally being honest. Her divorce attorney would contact him the following week, she said, and then she turned away and did not watch him go. Elias stood in the kitchen for a long moment that Maren did not see, looking at the suitcase the way a man looks at a thing that confirms what he already suspected. He picked up the briefcase, not the suitcase, left the suitcase exactly where it was, and he set his key down on the table with a softness that was nothing like defeat. Before he walked out, he slid a sealed envelope across the surface of the table with one finger, and on the outside in his careful handwriting were the words, "Do not sign the closing documents before you know who actually owns Atlas Grid." Maren saw the envelope and did not open it, did not even pick it up, but slid it into the kitchen drawer with the same motion she might use to dismiss a bill she did not want to think about yet. She heard the front door close, heard the elevator, and then heard nothing, and the silence of the apartment felt briefly like victory. before it settled into something else she could not name. Somewhere below the city, in the rain, Elias walked 3 blocks to a covered parking structure and sat in his car with the engine off. And when his phone lit up with a call from attorney Lenora Whitcomb, he answered on the first ring. 8 years earlier, Maren Caldwell had been a woman with a vision and no product. Sharp enough to see the market, disciplined enough to pitch investors, but standing at the edge of an industry that required technology she did not know how to build. Elias had been a systems architect with a different problem. He had already built something extraordinary and watched a former employer claim it as their own, and the experience had taught him that intellectual property without legal protection was simply a gift waiting to be taken. He had spent 3 years developing the original prototype of Atlas Grid before he ever met Maren, working through nights in a rented studio apartment, running stress tests on logistics models that the industry had not yet imagined asking for, and the algorithm that emerged from that period was not the product of inspiration but of methodical, unglamorous labor that most people in the industry would never understand well enough to appreciate. Atlas Grid could predict supply chain bottlenecks before they occurred, dynamically allocate vehicles across distribution networks, and reduce per-unit shipping costs in ways that traditional routing systems could not touch. And when Elias showed it to Maren over dinner one evening, she understood immediately that she was looking at the engine her company needed. He offered her a license to use the prototype. Not ownership, but use, a revocable license at $1 per year. And Maren signed the agreement without reading it in its entirety, because she believed that the assets of a husband were naturally also the assets of a wife's company. That what was his was hers by the simple logic of marriage. The distinction mattered in ways that would not become apparent for years. Elias had structured the license carefully and deliberately, with help from Lenora Whitcomb, who had handled his intellectual property since the day he watched his former employer file patents on work that was his. He had not done this to trap Maren or prepare for a divorce he did not yet imagine. He had done it because the only lesson his professional life had ever taught him was that paperwork is the only memory that cannot be argued away. While Maren built Caldwell Vector into a company with real revenue and real clients, Elias continued developing Atlas Grid in the background, releasing version after version to the platform, never seeking credit in any public forum, because the full patent protection on certain core elements was still pending, and he did not want a competitor to discover his authorship before the filings were complete. His silence had been strategic, not passive, the silence of a man protecting something. But Maren had long since stopped asking why he stayed quiet, and had simply concluded that he had nothing worth saying. Victor Ashbourne had appeared 18 months before the night of the champagne, had taken Maren to dinners at restaurants that cost more than most people's rent, and had whispered over those dinners that a woman of her talent deserved a partner who matched her ambition rather than diminished it. He had never said Elias's name directly. He had not needed to. Elias arrived at Lenora's office just before midnight, with the original source code on a secure drive, the full patent filing history, and the signed license agreement bearing Maren's signature from 8 years earlier. He set these 3 items on the desk in front of Lenora the way a man sets down evidence he has been carrying for a long time. And Lenora, who had not slept well in 20 years of intellectual property law, was nonetheless awake, in a way the documents made necessary. She told him she could send a cease and desist to Caldwell Vector within the hour, that she could halt the entire transaction before morning, and Elias shook his head before she finished the sentence. He did not want to destroy the company. There were 312 employees, whose livelihoods ran through the platform he had built, and none of them had asked Victor Ashbourne to walk into their industry and repackage their futures as acquisition targets. He wanted something narrower and more specific. He wanted the lawyers in that closing room to ask the right question, and he wanted Maren to hear the answer from someone she could not dismiss. Lenora studied him across the desk for a long moment and then said what she had been holding since before he arrived. The legal team at Ashbourne Global had known about the ownership gap for at least 6 weeks. They had known, and they had said nothing, because they had been counting on Marin not knowing either. 3 days passed in the way that consequential days pass, quickly on the surface, with an unbearable weight underneath. Marin arrived at the closing meeting in the 42nd floor conference room of Wexley and Partners, wearing the dark blazer she reserved for the moments she needed to feel invincible, and the room around her had the particular hush of people who have been asked to witness something significant. Victor was already seated when she arrived, positioned at the far end of the table with the comfortable authority of a man who considers every room he enters to already belong to him. And Nolan Pierce, Caldwell Vector's chief financial officer, stood near the window, reviewing documents on his tablet with the studied nonchalance of a man managing something he did not want anyone to see him managing. Graham Wexley, the lead transactional attorney handling the deal, was the only person in the room who appeared neither relaxed nor celebratory. And Marin noted this, the way you note an unfamiliar sound in a building you have lived in for years, briefly, and then not at all. She took her seat. Graham placed the closing package on the table before her, a bound stack of documents that represented months of negotiation distilled into signatures and dollar amounts. And Marin reached for the first page. The name appeared at the top of the intellectual property schedule in clean black type. Elias Reed, sole inventor and beneficial licensor. She turned the page, and the name appeared again in the patent assignment clause. She turned further and found it in the technology transfer terms, in the source code provenance declaration, in the indemnification section, and in the representations and warranties where she had certified, on a page she now realized she had signed without reading, that Caldwell Vector held unencumbered ownership of all core technology. The room had not changed around her. The same people sat in the same positions. But the documents were no longer the documents she believed she had spent 6 months negotiating, and the ground under Marin's certainty had shifted in a way that made the entire edifice above it uncertain. She told Graham the name was a mistake, that Elias had provided technical support years ago, but had never held ownership rights, and her voice was steady because she did not yet understand the full shape of what she was looking at. Graham slid a document across the table. The original license agreement from 8 years earlier, Marin's signature at the bottom, the language of the revocable license, unmistakable to anyone reading it for the first time or the 20th. Graham explained it plainly. Caldwell Vector had never owned Atlas Grid. The company had operated under a temporary, revocable license granted by Elias Reed, and that license had never been converted into an ownership transfer. The $26 million was sitting in an escrow account and would remain there until Elias signed an exclusive assignment of the intellectual property. Without that signature, there was no transaction. And because Marin had certified Caldwell Vector's ownership in the representations and warranties, she had potentially made a material misrepresentation in a multi-million-dollar commercial transaction, not necessarily with criminal intent, but with consequences that would not be limited to embarrassment. She turned to Victor. His expression did not change, which was its own kind of answer, and what he said was not reassuring but calculating. He asked what it would take to get Elias to sign, not whether Elias had been wronged, not whether the deal should be restructured, just the price. And Marin understood, sitting in that room with the documents spread before her and the $26 million suspended in escrow like a held breath, that Victor had always known Elias was the one who held the real authority in this transaction, and he had simply been waiting for the right moment to name that price. Graham told her she had 24 hours. Marin sat in her car in the parking structure beneath the building for a long time before she could move. She called Nolan, who answered on the second ring with a tone so practiced in reassurance that it registered as its own kind of alarm. And she asked him directly why no one had flagged the ownership issue during due diligence. He told her the documents were technical matters, minor legal architecture, easily resolved with a conversation, and that the important thing now was to reach Elias quickly and efficiently. His calm was the calm of a man who had already planned for this moment. She called Elias 4 times from the parking structure, then twice more from the lobby, then once more sitting in traffic on the way across town. The calls went unanswered without going to voicemail, which meant he was seeing her name and choosing silence with the same deliberateness he applied to everything else. She drove to the apartment where a mutual friend had once offered him a place to stay, and rang the bell to no answer. She stood on the step for a moment, listening to the building's stillness, before accepting there was nothing to wait for. She drove to a hotel near his former studio space, described him at the front desk, and was told politely that guest information was private. She sat in the lobby for 20 minutes staring at the elevator, constructing in her mind the version of the conversation that ended with his cooperation. Before she drove back across the city, understanding that she had never previously needed to ask Laius for anything. She had always simply expected him to be present when she required him, the way you expect a building to have walls. Meanwhile, in Lenora's office on the 14th floor of a building 3 miles away, the attorney was laying out for Elias the actual architecture of the transaction Victor had constructed. The $26 million was not an investment in Caldwell Vector's growth. It was a purchase price for exclusive perpetual rights to Atlas Grid, packaged as a minority investment to avoid triggering the contract language that would have required Elias's consent. Once Ashbourne Global held those exclusive rights, the platform's data, client relationships, and routing infrastructure would be transferred to a subsidiary entity that Marin would have no equity in and no authority over. The original company would be left holding a logo and a contract with no technology beneath it, and Victor would have moved the actual asset offshore within 1 fiscal quarter. The 312 employees of Caldwell Vector had never appeared in any of Victor's projections, except as a line item under cost reduction. Nolan Pierce had been promised the chief executive title in the successor company, in exchange for keeping these details away from Marin's attention, which he had accomplished by flagging Elias's legal correspondence as low priority, redirecting emails, and deleting a series of calendar reminders Elias had asked him to forward to the board. Marin finally opened the envelope. She had been carrying it since that morning in the kitchen drawer, and she opened it sitting in her car under a parking structure fluorescent light. And the contents were not what she had expected. Inside was a copy of Appendix 7.4 with specific clauses highlighted in yellow, a list of transaction terms with handwritten margin notes explaining what each one actually meant, and a half-page note in Elias's handwriting that said he was not trying to stop her from succeeding. He was trying to stop them from taking everything. She sat with the papers in her hands for a long time. She had told herself for months that Elias's silence about the ownership structure was a form of control, a way of keeping her dependent on him without appearing to, and it was difficult to dismantle that story in the span of one parking garage evening. But the letter was dated 4 months earlier, and the highlighted clauses were exactly the ones Graham had cited this afternoon, and the margin note beside the exclusive assignment clause said simply, "This gives them the right to shut us down and call it restructuring." Elias agreed to meet. He required that Lenora be present, along with Graham Wexley, Marin, and at least 2 members of the board who were not aligned with Ashbourne Global's proposal. Marin agreed to every condition. When she walked into the conference room the following morning, Elias was already seated at the head of the table. Marin accused him immediately of waiting for the most damaging possible moment to surface the ownership issue, and her voice had the sharp edge of someone who knows they are partially in the wrong but cannot yet afford to admit it fully. Elias did not raise his voice. He asked Lenora to project the communication log he had assembled over the previous 6 months. Emails sent to Marin's personal and professional accounts, meeting requests submitted through the company's scheduling system, a certified letter delivered to the apartment, and 3 separate requests sent through Nolan Pierce's office for a 45-minute review of the pending transaction's intellectual property schedule. None of these had received a response. The meeting requests had been declined automatically. The certified letter had been signed for by a building employee, but never reached Marin. The emails to Nolan had been read. The read receipts were in the log, and archived without reply. Elias had not been silent out of indifference or strategy in those 6 months. He had been systematically kept out of the conversation by the person whose job was to ensure Marin was informed. He then addressed the board directly. He had never charged Caldwell Vector a commercial rate for Atlas Grid's use. He had never drawn a salary from the company, never accepted equity as compensation for the work he continued to do on the platform, and never filed a claim against the company during the 8 years of their marriage, even as the company's valuation grew into something that reflected the algorithm's value more than any other single factor. He had no intention of extracting personal financial benefit from the current situation. What he could not do, what he refused to do, was sign an exclusive assignment that would transfer Atlas Grid to a corporate structure designed to eliminate the people who had built their professional lives around it. He placed 4 conditions on the table, written on a single sheet of paper. Victor Ashbourne and all Ashbourne Global representatives would be removed from the transaction. Caldwell Vector would undergo an independent financial audit before any new agreement was signed. Employees would receive an ownership stake in whatever entity emerged from the restructuring. No involuntary terminations for a minimum of 18 months. Victor responded with the precise calibration of a man who knows how to make reasonableness sound like aggression. He said Elias was leveraging a personal grievance to hold a legitimate commercial transaction hostage, that the board should consider the reputational cost of allowing a disgruntled spouse to derail a $26 million deal, and that Elias's conditions were structured to punish Marin professionally for the dissolution of a private relationship. Elias looked at him for a moment without speaking. Then he said that none of his 4 conditions included $1 of personal compensation, that his share of any licensing revenue would be directed into a technology development and employment protection fund, and that he had, as of the previous evening, received letters of intent from 3 other logistics companies interested in a non-exclusive licensing arrangement for Atlas Grid, letters which, taken together, represented a revenue path that would sustain Caldwell Vector's operations without the involvement of Ashbourne Global or its capital. Victor's composure did not break, but something behind his eyes adjusted, the way a calculation adjusts when a variable changes. Before anyone could respond, Tessa Vaughn's call came through on Marin's phone, and when Marin put it on speaker, the voice that filled the room was not calm. The company's financial servers were being accessed remotely, and data was being deleted at a rate that did not suggest maintenance. The only person with administrative access at that level, outside of Marin herself, was Nolan Pierce. The room found Nolan still in his chair, his hand on his laptop, and he did not deny what was happening. He closed the computer, stood, and walked out without a word, and no one moved to stop him because the shock of confirmation is briefly paralyzing in a way that only evidence can produce. Tessa moved faster than anyone anticipated. She had been with Caldwell Vector since the company had 12 employees and a single contract, and her loyalty to the institution she had helped build was not abstract. It was operational, which meant that when she suspected Nolan might attempt something destructive, she had, 2 days earlier, quietly created redundant encrypted backups of every financial record on an isolated server that Nolan's credentials could not reach. The deletion Nolan attempted from the parking garage outside the building removed several directories from the primary server, but touched nothing Tessa had protected, and within 90 minutes the forensic picture of what he had been doing for the previous 14 months was fully intact. Elias did not personally access the company's systems. He had installed years earlier, and with full legal authority, an integrity verification layer inside Atlas Grid that logged every interaction with the platform's core infrastructure, and those logs contained timestamps showing that Nolan had shared a partial version of the source code with an Ashbourne Global subsidiary 7 weeks before the closing meeting. Before due diligence had formally concluded, before any disclosure agreement permitted it, and before Marin had any reason to believe her chief financial officer was working against her. The logs also showed Nolan altering board meeting minutes from 2 separate quarterly reviews, removing language from the written record that would have flagged the intellectual property exposure to board members who might have asked questions. email threads between Nolan and a senior Ashbourne Global executive, recovered from the backup server, laid out the arrangement plainly. Nolan would manage Marin's information environment to ensure she signed the representations and warranties without consulting Elias, and in exchange he would receive the chief executive title in the successor entity that Ashbourne Global planned to register after the acquisition closed. The plan had assumed Elias would either be unaware of the transaction or too disempowered by the dissolution of his marriage to mount a credible challenge. It had not accounted for the possibility that Elias had spent the better part of a year preparing a documented record of exactly what was happening. Marin confronted Nolan in a small conference room with 2 board members present. He did not perform innocence. He had been in corporate rooms long enough to know when the evidence made innocence implausible, and what he said instead was something Marin would turn over in her mind for a long time afterward. He said she had been so committed to the identity of a successful CEO that she had stopped asking the questions that would have endangered that identity. He was not wrong, and the specific cruelty of that accuracy was that it arrived from someone she had trusted. Victor called an emergency board session from his hotel suite and attempted to frame the situation as Elias weaponizing intellectual property in retaliation for a personal betrayal. And for approximately 40 minutes, the board fractured along the lines that fear and money always produce. Some members prepared to accept any terms that preserved the $26 million. Others beginning to ask why none of this had appeared in the due diligence summary they had received 3 months earlier. Marin said nothing during Victor's presentation. She sat at the table and let him speak, and when he finished, she did not defend herself, but asked the board to hear what Lenora and Graham had to say. And the expression on her face was not the face she usually wore in a boardroom. It was the face of a woman who had stopped managing the perception of herself and started listening to the room she was actually in. Victor opened with a narrative, which was always his preferred instrument in a contested room. Elias Reed as a wounded man, a man left behind by a more successful wife, a man using the technical leverage of an old contract to settle a personal score in a professional arena. He had the delivery of someone who has used this particular argument before and found it effective, and 2 of the board members, the ones who had come into the process through Victor's introductions, visibly relaxed as he spoke, as if the human drama explanation made the legal complexity manageable. Elias waited until Victor was finished. He then stood and moved through the timeline of Atlas Grid's development with the precision of a man who had spent years building systems that had to account for every variable. And what he presented was not a counter-narrative but a chronology. Dates, version numbers, patent filing receipts, the original license agreement, every update to the platform with its accompanying timestamp and authorship metadata. The question of who created Atlas Grid was not a matter of competing claims or disputed recollection. It was documented in a way that legal systems exist to honor. Lenora addressed the board on the specific question Victor had raised, whether a marital relationship could be interpreted to transfer intellectual property rights automatically to a spouse's company. The answer was no, and it was not a close question, and the property in question had existed before the marriage began. Graham confirmed that Ashbourne Global's own legal team had identified the ownership issue during a preliminary title search conducted 6 weeks before the closing meeting, and that the team had made a documented internal decision not to disclose the finding to Marin's attorneys, choosing instead to proceed on the assumption that the marital breakdown would pressure Elias into a disadvantageous negotiation. Tessa presented the employment data, Ashbourne Global's internal restructuring plans, recovered from the backup server, projected eliminating 68% of Caldwell Vector's workforce within the first 2 quarters following acquisition. The number sat in the room like a physical object. Nolan was brought back into the session. He sat at the far end of the table and did not look at anyone directly. When the board presented the email threads, he confirmed their authenticity without being asked to. The particular exhaustion of a man who no longer has the energy to maintain a position that has already collapsed. The board voted to remove all Ashbourne Global representatives from the negotiation process and to place Nolan on immediate administrative leave pending a full investigation. Then came the vote Marin had been expecting since the morning, her own role. The board voted to suspend her as chief executive, not because she had acted with criminal intent, but because she had signed representations she had not verified, had failed to follow through on multiple requests for review, and had allowed her company's governance structure to be hollowed out by a combination of flattery and inattention. She did not object. It was the first board vote she could remember not finding a way to influence, and the absence of the effort felt not like defeat, but like the removal of something she had been carrying without knowing its weight. Elias had the legal authority, in this moment, to terminate the license entirely and leave Caldwell Vector without its core product. The room understood this. The room waited. He said Atlas Grid would continue to operate. It simply would not operate inside the company Victor had intended to turn it into. The restructuring proposal Elias placed on the table had been prepared in the weeks before the champagne and the suitcase, because Elias had understood before Marin did that the transaction was not what it appeared to be, and that the most responsible use of the time he had was to design an alternative. Atlas Commonworks was organized as a public benefit company, a structure that requires any entity holding it to balance profit against the interests of workers, community, and long-term sustainability. Caldwell Vector would retain the right to use Atlas Grid in perpetuity, not through a revocable license, but through a permanent operational agreement, in exchange for restructuring its ownership, so that employees held 20% of the equity collectively, with 2 seats on the board of directors that could only be held by people who were not executives or investors. Tessa Vaughn was named interim chief executive. Elias asked the board to confirm her formally within 60 days after an evaluation process that did not involve any input from Ashbourne Global or its former associates. Marin was offered a position as Director of Client Relations. She accepted it without the performance of gratitude. She would have applied to the same offer 2 weeks earlier, and the absence of performance was its own form of growth. She would hold no voting rights for 2 years. She would be required to present a public acknowledgement of the governance failures on her watch to the full company, not as punishment, but as the kind of accountability that makes institutional trust possible again. These terms had not been designed by Elias to humiliate her. They had been designed by a restructuring attorney who understood that companies do not recover from near collapses by pretending the near collapse did not reveal something real about how decisions had been made. Victor Ashbourne lost the transaction, and with it the leverage he had spent 14 months constructing. The civil litigation that followed, brought by Caldwell Vector's new board against Ashbourne Global for conspiracy, fraudulent misrepresentation during due diligence, and misappropriation of proprietary code shared without authorization, was not swift and was not dramatic. His partners began conducting their own reviews of recent transactions. His board opened a governance inquiry. The particular kind of power that depends on no one looking closely is the kind that dissolves the moment someone does. That evening, after the board session ended and the attorneys filed out, Marin found herself in the apartment that had once been theirs. Elias came to collect the last of what was his, and they sat in the kitchen without the table between them for the first time in months. She apologized for calling him a failure, and the apology was specific and genuine, not for the Atlas Grid revelation, not because he had proven himself powerful, but because she had spent years measuring a person she once chose carefully against a standard she had borrowed from someone who had wanted to use her. She told him she understood now that she had stopped respecting him before she stopped loving him, and that the order of those 2 things mattered. She asked if they could begin again. Elias was quiet for a moment, and then he said what he understood to be true, that love could survive failure, survive distance, survive even betrayal in some of its forms, but it could not survive the condition that a person must first demonstrate power before they earn the right to be treated with dignity. He had not left the marriage because he was angry. He had left because he understood that going back would require Marin to unsee something she now clearly saw. and that the effort of unseen things eventually costs more than the things themselves. He continued the divorce proceedings. Before he left, he placed the apartment key on the kitchen table one final time, and he picked up the leather briefcase, and he walked out. 6 months passed the way months do after a crisis that has been survived, rather than averted. Steadily, with unexpected moments of ordinary life interrupting the sense that everything is still in a state of resolution. Atlas Commonworks signed 11 independent contracts in its first operating quarter, each one smaller than the single arrangement Victor had proposed, and each one representing a client relationship that would not be lost if any single partner withdrew. The combined revenue from those 11 agreements exceeded the figure that had sat in escrow during the worst week of Marin's professional life. And the difference was that no single investor held the ability to redirect that revenue away from the people who had generated it. Not one employee was involuntarily separated. The equity fund Elias had established distributed its first payment to participating employees 9 months after Atlas Commonworks was incorporated, and several of those employees had never before owned a share of anything. For some of them, the amount was modest. Enough for a car payment, a semester of tuition, a buffer against the kind of emergency that had previously meant asking for a loan. But the meaning of it was not in the dollar figure. It was in the fact that the platform they had spent years supporting now recognized, in a legal and financial structure that could not easily be undone, that they were part of what it was worth. Marin worked under Tessa's leadership with a quality of attention she had not previously applied to the details of other people's work, because she was no longer managing the story of herself that needed those details to remain invisible. There was a particular discipline required in that. The discipline of being useful without being in charge, of contributing without controlling the credit. And Marin discovered that she possessed it more readily than she would have predicted, which suggested it had always been available to her, and she had simply been choosing something else. She no longer had the corner office or the chief executive title, and the absence of those things revealed, slowly, that she had been using them to avoid a form of listening that requires you to believe the people in the room have something worth hearing. Tessa was a different kind of leader than Marin, quieter, more interested in process than announcement, and watching her work was the closest Marin had come in years to learning something she had not already decided she knew. At a national technology and logistics conference held in the spring, Elias Reed was introduced on the main stage as the creator of Atlas Grid, and for the first time his name appeared not in a contract clause or a legal filing, but in the lights of a platform that existed to recognize people whose work had shaped an industry. He walked onto the stage without a tailored suit assembled for the occasion, without the choreography of an entrance designed to signal wealth, without any of the equipment that power sometimes requires to announce itself. And there was something in that plainness that the audience in the hall seemed to recognize as the signature of a person who had not needed to perform their own importance because the work had already made the argument. The audience in the hall rose before he reached the microphone. The applause was not for his net worth, or his legal victory, or the way the story had resolved. It was for the technology itself, for the thing he had built in a rented studio apartment before anyone was paying attention, which had since protected hundreds of jobs that would have otherwise been numbers in a restructuring memo. Marin stood at the back of the hall. She did not approach the stage. She did not signal to him across the room that she was there, and that she was changed, and that she hoped he could see it. She simply stood in the back and clapped with everyone else, which was its own kind of honesty. The honesty of a person who has accepted that the appropriate response to what she had done was not to immediately receive absolution but to be present, without requiring anything in return. Elias saw her as he was leaving the stage. He did not cross the room. He did not gesture for her to come forward. He looked at her from the distance and gave a small, unhurried nod. Not the nod of reconciliation, not the nod of forgiveness as a conclusion to a story, but the nod of two people who have arrived at the same understanding through entirely different routes and do not need to discuss it. On the small placard beside the Atlas Grid demonstration display near the conference entrance, Below the system diagram and the performance metrics and the names of the companies currently using the platform, a single line had been added at the request of the Atlas Common Works Board. It read, "Created by Elias Reed. Built to protect people, not control them." 3 days after, he had walked out of his own home in the rain, carrying nothing but a worn leather briefcase. Elias Reed had not reclaimed his marriage. He had reclaimed his name.